You guys have been sending in some really fascinating stuff about the global election results, and there's one article in particular that I have to talk about. It really highlights this trend, this global trend that's got a lot of people like really scratching their heads, incumbent governments losing ground. I mean, like
Yeah.
everywhere. This is not just like a little blip on the radar either. 2024 was like a historically bad year for anyone in power.
Yeah. It really is remarkable just how widespread this is,
Hmm.
The article actually points out that it's the first time all the way back to 1905 that every single incumbent party in these developed countries has lost vote share. I mean, that's huge. That's not just a change in the wind. It's like a full-blown political hurricane.
So we've got this puzzle in front of us, you know. What are the root causes of this global political earthquake? What's going on? I'm dying to unpack this with you.
Well, the article doesn't really say there's this like one single smoking gun that's causing all of this. It's more like a bunch of different things all coming together at the same time. But there's one thing that keeps popping up over and over again, that post-COVID economic landscape.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, the past few years have been a complete roller coaster for the global economy. I mean, between all the pandemic disruptions and the anxieties about inflation and then supply chain issues everywhere, it just seems like everyone's wallet has taken a huge hit.
Absolutely. And all that anxiety, it's turning into a political fallout,
Yeah.
big time. For example, in the U.S., voters were really struggling with rising prices on like everything,
Yeah.
groceries, gas, you name it. And then you add on top of that the fact that mortgage rates went way up and credit card debts through the roof. And it's pretty obvious why economic concerns were like the number one issue in the election that brought Donald Trump back into the White House.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not even just about what's actually happening in the economy. It's also about how people perceive it and who voters believe is actually equipped to handle it. You know what I mean?
You're exactly right. And we're seeing this play out all over the world. Just look at the UK, for example. Their inflation rates just skyrocketed. And what happened? Voters gave the Conservative Party, which was the ruling party, their worst defeat in almost 200 years. That's sending a pretty clear message.
2 centuries. Wow. I mean, they haven't seen numbers like that since like the horse and buggy days. That is a serious rejection of how things have been.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know what? This trend isn't just limited to Western democracies. Even in a place like Japan, which is known for its political stability, the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been in power there for a really long time, they really felt the heat. Decades of economic stagnation combined with these recent price increases, it really eroded their support.
So even in a country with a history of basically backing the establishment, voters were ready for a change. It really does look like this economic discontent is like a genuinely global thing.
It really is, and it's impacting even the most powerful figures in the world. The article brings up the example of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Hmm.
Even with his really strong man image, he couldn't secure a parliamentary majority. People were worried about jobs and the economy, and that was a big reason why he didn't win.
So it's like across the board from Washington to Tokyo to New Delhi, voters are feeling the pressure and they're letting their feelings be known at the ballot box. This economic anxiety, it's like the common thread that ties all of this together.
Yeah.
But you know, the article also mentions how these economic worries were often like amplified by other anxieties, especially worries about immigration.
Yeah, and you have to be careful not to oversimplify that link. It's not about immigration itself, but more about how people see it and the stories that get told about it, especially when it's tied to the economy.
So it's less about like the actual numbers of immigrants and more about the way those numbers are presented and the fears that they tap into.
Exactly. And certain political groups got really good at taking advantage of those fears. They would often connect immigration to economic problems. In the U.S., for example, Trump's campaign really focused on border security and being tough on immigration.
And it wasn't just Trump. We saw the same kind of rhetoric from those right-wing parties in Europe, too. Parties in France,
Yeah.
Belgium, Austria. They all gained support by focusing on immigration from Muslim-majority countries and a lot of times connecting it to economic hardship and cultural change.
Yeah, that strategy played on this feeling of unease and uncertainty that people had, especially those who felt like their governments weren't listening to their concerns or actually looking out for them.
It really does seem like this gap between the people in charge and everyday citizens is a big part of the problem.
Hmm.
The article talks about this rise of populism and how people are increasingly distrusting these traditional institutions.
That's a really important point. The article uses this term, out-of-touch elites, and it describes this feeling that a lot of voters have that the people in power are benefiting from globalization and technology, while everyday people are left dealing with all the downsides, losing jobs, seeing their culture change, facing all this economic uncertainty.
It's like this us versus them mentality where the them is increasingly seen as unresponsive and unaccountable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can see this frustration in the way that people are choosing their leaders.
Hmm.
Politicians are being judged not just on their policies anymore, but also on whether they seem authentic and whether they can relate to the struggles that people are dealing with every day.
That is a fascinating dynamic. But something that's been on my mind is the role of social media in all this. The
Mhm.
article mentions it, and I'm really curious to dig into that a little more.
That's a really great point to bring up, and it's definitely something worth exploring. The article talks about research that suggests those social media algorithms, especially the ones that are designed to keep you engaged, they might actually be contributing to a more negative environment without meaning to.
Wait, hold on. How could an algorithm contribute to people feeling negative? It's just code, right?
Yeah, it is code, but it's code that's designed to keep you scrolling and what keeps people scrolling.
Yeah.
Usually it's stuff that triggers strong emotions, outrage, fear, anxiety.
Mm.
The algorithm doesn't care if it's positive or negative, it just wants to keep you hooked. And some people argue that being exposed to this constant stream of negativity can make it harder for people to feel good about the world, and that includes their governments.
So, in a way, social media could be amplifying these anxieties that are already bubbling under the surface.
Exactly. And it all feeds into this idea that's really caught my attention. It's called a global emotional recession. Imagine a decline in overall well-being, like a collective bad mood. And it's being linked to all sorts of things: pandemic, stress, economic anxieties,
Hmm.
and yes, even social media.
Okay, now that is intriguing. This global emotional recession. I'm really curious about this. Let's dive into that a little bit more after a quick break. So this idea of a global emotional recession, it's really fascinating. You said it's connected to pandemic stress and economic anxieties and even social media. But what does that actually look like? I mean, how is it showing up around the world?
Well, the research shows some pretty clear signs. Increased levels of stress and anxiety, even depression. We're also seeing that people are less satisfied with their lives overall, and they're feeling more pessimistic about the future. Like there's this collective sense of unease, and it's affecting a lot of different parts of life.
Yeah, that is a little disheartening. I mean, we all feel those things individually sometimes, but to think about it as like this global phenomenon, it's a bit unsettling.
It is concerning,
Mm.
but it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be this way. There are things we can do both individually and as a society to address these issues and try to build a more hopeful and resilient future.
Okay, I'm all ears. What can we do to fight back against this emotional downturn, especially with all these complicated factors involved?
One really important step is to prioritize mental health and well-being. That means investing in mental health services and making sure people know how to cope in healthy ways. It also means creating communities where people feel supported and comfortable talking about their struggles and asking for help.
So it's about creating a culture where we treat mental health just as importantly as we treat physical health.
Exactly. And it's not just about focusing on individuals, it's about addressing the bigger systemic issues that are contributing to all this stress and anxiety. Things like poverty and inequality and discrimination.
Right, that makes sense. If people are constantly struggling to make ends meet or facing obstacles because of who they are, it's no wonder they're feeling stressed and anxious.
And then there's social media, which is a big one. We have to figure out how to reduce the negative impacts it's having on our mental health. And it's not about saying all technology is bad, it's about learning to use it in a more mindful and balanced way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's so easy to get sucked into that endless scroll on social media, and suddenly you've spent hours looking at stuff that just leaves you feeling drained and worried.
It's all about being more aware of how social media makes you feel and setting boundaries for yourself. Maybe that means limiting your screen time or being more careful about who you follow. Or you could make a conscious effort to seek out content that makes you feel good and inspires you.
So it's about taking control of your online experience instead of letting it control you.
Exactly. And we also need to help people develop their critical thinking skills and learn how to be more media literate. We need to be able to tell the difference between real information and fake information. Understand how those algorithms work and be aware of how our online experiences are being manipulated.
So it's like we need a global movement towards a digital detox and more awareness about how the media works. But how do we move from individual actions to actually changing things on a larger scale?
I think it starts with having open and honest conversations about these issues, just like what we're doing right now. We need to raise awareness, share resources, and support groups and initiatives that are trying to improve mental health and well-being.
I totally agree. Okay, so we've talked about the individual level and the societal level, but what about our leaders? What role do they play in all this? How can political leaders help address this global emotional recession and start to rebuild people's trust in democratic institutions?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's not an easy one to answer. But I think one of the most important things is empathy. Leaders need to acknowledge and validate people's anxieties. They can't just dismiss them as being irrational or uninformed.
So they need to recognize that these anxieties are coming from real experiences and real worries that people have.
Exactly. Leaders need to show that they understand the challenges that people are facing and that they're actually committed to finding solutions. And they need to be more transparent and accountable in the decisions they make.
People need to feel like they're being heard and that their leaders are actually representing them.
Absolutely. And it's not just about policies either. It's about restoring a sense of connection and shared purpose. Leaders need to be able to articulate a vision for the future that gives people hope and makes them feel optimistic.
It's like they need to paint a picture of a future where everyone feels valued and like they have a part to play in society's success.
That's a great way to put it. It's about moving beyond all that divisive rhetoric and finding some common ground.
This kind of brings us back to that whole populism thing we were talking about earlier. Those populist leaders, a lot of times, they get their power by exploiting people's anxieties and divisions. How can we push back against that?
Well, it's not about silencing people who have different opinions. It's about promoting a public discourse that's more nuanced and informed. It's about encouraging people to think critically and consider different perspectives.
It's about creating spaces where people can have disagreements respectfully without resorting to personal attacks or spreading misinformation.
Exactly. And we need to hold our leaders accountable for what they say and do.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how all of this is affecting the world as a whole. You mentioned earlier that this trend of incumbents losing elections could be a sign that things are moving away from globalization as we know it. Can you say more about that?
Well, one thing we're seeing is that a lot of countries are starting to adopt protectionist policies. They're becoming more inward-looking and focused on their own national interests instead of cooperating globally.
So it's like a retreat from that interconnected world that we've gotten used to.
Yeah, kind of. And the pandemic definitely made this trend worse. It showed everyone how vulnerable those global supply chains are, and that led a lot of countries to adopt more nationalist policies.
So are we headed towards a world that's more fragmented? A world where countries aren't as willing to work together to solve problems?
That's a valid concern.
Hmm.
If this keeps going, it could have really serious consequences for issues that require global cooperation, like climate change, pandemic preparedness, international security.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But is there any hope for a more cooperative future?
I think there is. It's important to remember that globalization has actually led to a lot of progress in many areas, like reducing poverty and advancing technology.
So it's not all bad news.
Definitely not. But we need to rethink how we do globalization. It needs to be more inclusive and sustainable and equitable.
So it's about finding that balance between looking out for your own national interests and being willing to cooperate with other countries.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that the benefits of globalization are shared more fairly and that certain groups or countries aren't stuck bearing most of the costs.
This brings us to another important question raised by all these elections. What happens to social cohesion when the world feels like it's becoming more and more divided?
That's a crucial issue. When societies are divided along political, economic, or social lines, it's really hard to find common ground and work together toward shared goals. And we've seen how these divisions can sometimes lead to more polarization and even violence.
That's a scary thought. So how do we bridge these gaps and rebuild social cohesion when the world feels like it's falling apart?
It's a tough challenge, but I think it starts with dialogue and understanding. We need to create spaces where people can have respectful conversations, even with people who have different viewpoints. It's about listening to each other, trying to see things from other perspectives, and recognizing that we all have a common interest in creating a more just and fair society.
It's about focusing on what brings us together instead of what pulls us apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about addressing those underlying economic and social inequalities that often lead to these divisions. Things like poverty, limited access to education, discrimination. All of those things create resentment and mistrust within societies.
It sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach that tackles both the symptoms and the root causes of social division.
Absolutely. It's a long-term project that requires commitment and collaboration from everyone. Government, civil society, businesses, individuals, everyone needs to be involved.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from economic anxieties to social media to the future of globalization. Before we wrap up, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
If I could leave the listener with one thing, it would be this. Don't underestimate the power of your own voice and your own actions. The trends we talked about today are definitely important, but they don't have to dictate the future. The future is still being shaped, and each one of us has a role to play in making it what we want it to be.
That's a powerful reminder. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a really enlightening conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into global election trends and what they mean for the future. We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought. Remember, the future isn't set in stone. We create it together, one choice, one action, one conversation at a time.
You know, it's funny how this whole conversation about like these huge global trends keeps coming back to like the individual. You were saying how we all have the power to make a difference. But when you look at these massive complex forces that are shaping the world, it's easy to feel like one person doesn't really matter all that much. Yeah, I get that. It can feel overwhelming for sure.
Yeah.
But I truly believe that when enough people start taking action, even small actions, it can have a real impact. It starts with recognizing that you have the power to make choices and then deciding to engage with the world in a way that's thoughtful and intentional.
So how does that actually work in real life? I mean,
Yeah.
where do you even begin when you're trying to tackle problems that are global in scale?
Well, one place to start is by becoming a more informed and engaged citizen. That means staying curious about the world, seeking out different viewpoints, and challenging your own assumptions. It also means holding your leaders accountable and participating in the democratic process. You know, voting, contacting your representatives, that kind of thing.
So basically showing up, speaking out, making your voice heard.
Exactly.
Huh.
And it's not just about politics. It's also about the choices you make every day. You can support businesses that are doing things you believe in. You can invest in sustainable practices. You can advocate for social justice.
It's like aligning your actions with your values and using your power as a consumer to actually create positive change.
Exactly. And it's also about building bridges within your own community, connecting with people who are different from you, fostering empathy and understanding.
It's about recognizing that we're all human beings sharing this planet and working together to make it a better place for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. At the end of the day, I think our ability to create a better future depends on whether we can cultivate hope and resilience and a sense of interconnectedness. It's about remembering that we're all in this together and we each have a part to play in building a more positive and sustainable world.
That is a really powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been such an enlightening conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into global election trends and what they might mean for the future. We hope this conversation has made you think and maybe even inspired you to get involved and make a difference. Remember, the future isn't something that's already decided. It's something we create together, one choice, one action, one conversation at a time.